The phone rang before I even finished setting my suitcase down. I had been standing in the middle of the living room, surrounded by unopened boxes, the smell of fresh pine drifting in through the open windows, when my phone started buzzing in my hand. The screen lit up with one word: Dad. My stomach tightened before I even answered. Something about the timing felt wrong, like the house itself had gone quiet, waiting. I said, "Hello." Dad did not ask how the drive was. He did not say, "Congratulations." He did not comment on the house or ask if I was settled in. His voice came through flat and clipped, like he was reading instructions off a list. He told me I needed to move my things up to the attic. He said the whole family was coming. He said they needed the bedrooms. For a second, I thought I had misheard him. I asked him to repeat himself. He did, slower this time, as if I were the one being unreasonable. He said this was not a discussion. He said family comes first. Then his voice dropped, hard and final. If I refused to welcome them, I would be dead to the family. I stood there holding the phone, staring at the far wall where the light from the porch spilled across the wood floor. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue. I did not even tell him this was my house. The words sat in my chest, heavy and useless. Dad waited for a response. When none came, he ended the call. The silence that followed was louder than anything he had said. I could hear the soft ticking of the wall clock I had hung earlier that afternoon. Somewhere outside, wind moved through the trees. This house had sounded alive an hour ago. Now it felt like it was holding its breath. I lowered myself onto the edge of the couch, phone still in my hand, and tried to understand how my first night here had turned into this. I had imagined this moment so differently. I thought the first night in my mountain house would be quiet in a good way. I pictured myself curled up on the couch with a blanket, a glass of wine on the coffee table, the windows open to the cool air. I thought I would sleep deeply, the kind of sleep that comes when you finally stop bracing yourself for the next thing to go wrong. Instead, I was sitting there replaying my dad's words over and over, each one landing harder than the last. Before I go any further, let me pause for just a moment. If you are listening to this right now, I am curious where you are and what you are doing. Are you driving, folding laundry, sitting with a cup of coffee like I was later that night, trying to calm your thoughts? Wherever you are, I hope you stay with me. I wish I could say I was shocked by what Dad said, but the truth is, part of me was not. This was not the first time he had spoken to me like I owed him something. It was just the first time he did it in my own house. I had worked most of my adult life for moments like this one. For years, I lived by my calendar and my inbox. I worked in tech consulting, the kind of job where the days bleed into each other and weekends are just quieter weekdays. 70-hour weeks were normal. 80-hour weeks were not unusual. I took calls in airports, finished reports in hotel rooms, and learned how to eat dinner out of takeout containers without really tasting the food. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself I was building something. When I finally got promoted at the start of 2025, I felt a rush of relief more than pride. It meant I could slow down. It meant I could stop proving myself every second of the day. A few months later, I signed the papers on this house. The mountain house sits tucked into the Blue Ridge Mountains, surrounded by tall trees and winding roads that force you to take your time. It is not flashy. It is solid and quiet and a little old-fashioned, with wide windows and a long porch that looks out over the hills. The first time I walked through it, I felt something loosen inside me, like my shoulders dropped an inch without me even realizing they had been. Tense. This was the first thing I had ever owned that was completely mine. No roommates, no shared leases, no compromises about space or noise or timing. I bought it with my own money, earned hour by hour, year by year. I bought it because Mom was gone. She passed away in 2023, and even now, saying that feels strange. The world kept moving after she died. Work deadlines did not care. Meetings still happened. People still asked how my weekend was. But something fundamental shifted for me. I realized how much of my life had been about endurance, about putting one foot in front of the other and telling myself I would rest later. Later, it finally came, and it looked like this house. That is why Dad's call cut so deeply. It was not just about the words. It was about what they represented. In his mind, this house was not my sanctuary. It was a resource, a space he could allocate as he saw fit, a thing that existed for the family, which somehow never seemed to include my needs. I stood up and walked through the house, room by room, touching the backs of chairs, the edge of the kitchen counter, the banister on the stairs. I needed to remind myself that this place was real, that it belonged to me. Upstairs, the bedrooms were empty, waiting. The attic was small and unfinished, with a low ceiling and a single window. David had told me to move there as if it were the most reasonable thing in the world. I imagined him saying it again, his tone steady, unquestioning. Move to the attic. We need the bedrooms. As if my presence in my own house was an inconvenience he was generously allowing me to work around. What surprised me most was my reaction. I did not feel angry right away. I felt still, calm in a way that did not feel healthy. It was the same calm I used to get in high-pressure meetings when someone tried to corner me. The calm that meant my mind was already moving ahead, looking for leverage, for clarity, for the part of the situation that others were ignoring. I realized something important that night. Dad did not see this as a visit. He had already decided how it would go. He had told other people they were coming. He had assigned rooms. He had drawn lines and expected me to step inside them. This was not a misunderstanding. It was a takeover, announced in advance, delivered without hesitation. I turned off the lights and sat on the couch in the dark, listening to the house settle around me. Somewhere between the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of wind, I made a quiet decision. I would not fight him. Not yet. I would not explain myself or defend my choices. I would watch, I would listen, and I would let him show me exactly how far he thought his authority over my life extended. Because if Dad believed I would simply disappear into the attic and make myself small, he did not know me as well as he thought. And that was something I intended to remember when morning came. I did not sleep much after that decision settled in my chest. When I finally drifted off, it was shallow and broken. The kind of sleep where your mind keeps one eye open. I woke before the sun, disoriented for a moment, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the house, the soft creak of wood as it cooled overnight, find brushing against the porch rail, a distant bird calling out, sharp and insistent. For a few seconds, I felt peaceful. Then the memory of Dad's voice slid back into place, heavy and exact, like a weight set carefully on my ribs. I sat up slowly, my feet touching the cold floor, and let the quiet stretch. There was no alarm clock, no meeting waiting, no flight to catch. That alone should have felt like freedom. Instead, it felt like standing in the eye of a storm, knowing the wind would hit eventually. I checked my phone without thinking. No new messages, no apology, no clarification. Adam had said what he needed to say. In his mind, the next step was already decided. I stood there longer than necessary, phone in my hand, thumb hovering over his name. This was the moment I had replayed in my head so many times over the years. The moment where I explained myself clearly and calmly, where I laid out my boundaries, where he finally understood that I was not a child anymore. I knew how that conversation would go. He would sigh. He would say I was being dramatic. He would remind me of everything he had ever done for me. He would frame my refusal as selfishness, as ingratitude, as something he needed to correct for my own good. And by the end of it, I would feel smaller, not stronger. So I set the phone down. I made coffee instead. The machine hissed and gurgled, filling the kitchen with a familiar sound that grounded me. I wrapped my hands around the mug and leaned against the counter, staring out the window at the trees. Morning light filtered through the branches, pale and gentle. This was what I had wanted. Space. Stillness. Time to breathe. I took the mug out to the porch and sat down, pulling my sweater tighter around me. The air was cool enough to sting my cheeks. I focused on simple things, the warmth of the coffee, the steady rhythm of my breath, the way the mountains looked from this angle, layered and quiet. For the first time since the phone call, my thoughts slowed. I realized something then that made my chest ache. Dad had not asked me to move to the attic because he needed the space. He had asked because he expected me to comply, because that was the role I had always filled. The one who adjusted, the one who smoothed things over, the one who made room. That expectation was older than this house, older than my career. It has followed me through every stage of my life. I finished my coffee and went back inside. Instead of calling Dad, I started packing. I moved deliberately, folding clothes the way I always did when I needed to think. Each shirt smoothed flat, each sweater stacked neatly. The act was almost meditative. With every item I carried upstairs, I paid attention to my own reaction, the tightness in my shoulders, the flare of anger that rose and fell, the strange calm that settled in when I reminded myself why I was doing this. I was not giving up my space. I was buying time. The attic sunlight streamed through the small window, illuminating floating particles in the air. It was not a welcoming room. The ceiling sloped low, forcing me to bend slightly as I moved around. I set my suitcase down and looked at it for a long moment. This is what he thinks is enough, I thought again. As I made trip after trip, memories surfaced without warning. The time Dad decided I should give my bedroom to a visiting relative when I was a teenager. The way he framed it as generosity, as maturity, as something to be proud of. The countless times I had swallowed my discomfort because pushing back felt worse than giving in. Those moments had trained me well. By the time I finished clearing the guest room, my arms ached and my patience was thin, but my resolve felt solid. I had not cried. I had not yelled. I had not pleaded. That in itself felt like a small victory. My phone buzzed mid-morning. A text from Dad. Just one word. Good. Then another message followed. They would be there later. I stared at the screen until it dimmed. There was a familiar urge to respond, to explain that this was not about family versus me, that this was about respect. But I stopped myself. Every explanation I had ever given Dad had been used against me, twisted into proof that I was overthinking, overreacting, making things difficult. So I did not reply. That silence was not passive, it was intentional. I spent the next hour making the house look neutral. I moved personal items into drawers. I cleared the kitchen counters. I took framed photos off the shelves and set them aside, carefully, as if they were fragile. Not because I was ashamed of them, but because I wanted to see what would happen when the space was open, how they would fill it. As I worked, Mom kept drifting into my thoughts. I could picture her standing in the kitchen, watching me with that quiet understanding she always had. She used to say that people reveal themselves when they think the outcome is already decided. I wondered if this was what she meant. Around midday, the sound of tires crunching on gravel reached the porch, then voices, laughter, the slam of a car door. I did not go downstairs. From where I sat, I could hear snippets of conversation drifting through the open windows. Someone admired the view. Someone else joked about who would get which room. Dad's voice carried clearly, confident and relaxed, as if he were welcoming guests into a place that belonged to him. The front door opened. Footsteps crossed the living room. Bags were set down. I stayed still, my heart pounding harder than I expected. This was the moment where everything in me wanted to intervene, to step in and assert myself. I stayed where I was. A while later, I heard footsteps on the stairs. Adam appeared in the doorway of the attic, pausing just long enough to take in the room. His eyes flicked from the bed to the window to the suitcase. He nodded once, satisfied. "This will work," he said. His tone was approving, almost cheerful. He added that everyone appreciated my flexibility. I nodded back. My face felt strangely calm, like it no longer belonged to me. He did not ask if I was comfortable. He did not ask if I needed help. He did not ask how I felt. He turned and left, already moving on to the next thing. As his footsteps faded, I sat down on the edge of the bed and let out a slow breath. My hands were shaking slightly. I pressed them flat against my thighs until they steadied. Something important clicked into place then. David was not worried about me pushing back. He was worried about disruption. And now that he believed the disruption had been avoided, he relaxed. That relaxation was dangerous for him, not for me. I stayed in the attic longer than I needed to, listening. The house was filled with noise. Voices echoed off the walls. Drawers opened and closed. Laughter burst out, unguarded and loud. No one came to check on me. That told me everything I needed to know. By the time evening approached, I felt strangely clear. Tired, yes. Sad, absolutely. But also focused. If I reacted emotionally now, I would lose the advantage I had gained by stepping back. Silence had already shifted the balance in ways they did not see. So I made a decision and locked it into place. I would not argue. I would not defend myself. I would not explain my boundaries to people who had already decided they did not matter. I would wait. I would watch, and I would let them reveal exactly how far they planned to go. Because when people believe you have accepted your place, they stop hiding their intentions. And I was done being surprised by mine. And I was no longer willing to disappear quietly into the corners they had chosen for me. The sound of tires on gravel grew louder, closer, until it echoed right up to the porch. One car became 2, then 3, then more than I could count from where I stood. Doors slammed, voices rose, overlapping and familiar, carrying the easy confidence of people who assumed they belonged wherever they landed. Laughter cut through the air, sharp and careless. The house changed in a matter of minutes. I stayed still at first, standing near the bottom of the stairs, listening as the front door swung open and stayed that way. Cold air rushed in along with the noise. Shoes were kicked off without anyone asking where they should go. A rolling suitcase bumped against the wall. Then another. Someone commented on the size of the place, impressed, like they were touring a vacation rental they had already paid for. David's voice was the loudest. Relaxed, familiar. He sounded like a man welcoming people into his own home. I stepped forward slowly. Not to greet anyone, but because I needed to see it. I needed to know exactly how far they were willing to go. Linda was the first person I really noticed. She moved with purpose, her eyes scanning the space, already assessing. She did not look at me when she walked past, just nodded vaguely, the way you do when you acknowledge a piece of furniture. Robert followed behind her, grinning, making jokes about who would get the best room, who would complain the most. No one asked me where they should put their bags. They did not wait. Linda opened the door to the largest bedroom and made a satisfied sound. She said it was perfect and immediately turned to Dad, telling him this was clearly where he and Elaine should stay. That was the moment my eyes landed on the woman standing just behind him. Elaine? She was casually dressed, but everything about her suggested comfort and entitlement. She did not hesitate. She stepped into the room like it had always been hers, running her hand along the dresser, peering into the bathroom, commenting on the space. She mentioned the light, the layout, and the size of the shower. Her tone was not curious or appreciative. It was evaluative. No one introduced her to me. She did not introduce herself either. She moved through the room with the confidence of someone who expected to be obeyed. She asked about water pressure and internet speed. She wanted to know where extra linens were kept. Dad answered her immediately, without looking at me, without checking whether I had a say. That was when something inside me tightened. This was not new for them. The ease between Dad and Elaine told me that much. He laughed at her comments. He leaned closer when she spoke. When she teased him about his taste in furniture, he smiled in a way I had not seen in a long time. They were comfortable together. Too comfortable. Linda began assigning rooms down the hall, calling out names, directing people like she was running logistics for an event. Robert kept the mood light, cracking jokes, slapping backs, making everything feel casual and harmless. It was not harmless. One by one, doors closed behind them as they claimed space. Someone chose the guest room I had cleared that morning. Another relative commented on the view from a different bedroom and declared it theirs. Suitcases were dragged across the floor. Drawers were opened. My things started to move. At first, it was small. A stack of books I had left on the coffee table was picked up and set aside. A throw blanket was folded and placed on a chair. Someone unplugged the lamp from the corner and carried it toward the back of the house. Then Linda asked where to put the extra boxes. Before I could answer, she suggested the garage. She said it would keep things tidy, practical, out of the way. And just like that, my belongings began to disappear. Boxes with my handwriting on them were lifted and carried out the back door. Framed photos were stacked carefully, almost kindly, and placed against the garage wall. My clothes, my shoes, the things I had unpacked only hours earlier were gathered up and relocated, like clutter that needed to be cleared. Neatly, efficiently, without a single word to me. I stood there watching it happen, my chest tight, my hands curled into fists at my sides. Every instinct in me screamed to stop it, to say something, to remind them whose house this was. But I did not move. Elaine drifted into the kitchen next. She opened cabinets without hesitation, peered into the refrigerator, made small noises that signaled disapproval. She commented on the lighting, said it was too bright, and asked if it could be adjusted. She wanted to know where groceries should go, whether there was more storage, whether the layout could be improved. David followed her, answering each question like a proud owner. That was when it became impossible to ignore. This was not her first time imagining herself here. Maybe she had not stood in this kitchen before, but she had pictured it, planned for it. She spoke about the house like it was already part of her life. At one point, she turned toward me and smiled, finally acknowledging that I existed. She commented on how lucky I was to have found such a place. She said it would be wonderful for family gatherings, for hosting, for bringing people together. The way she said it made it clear she already saw herself at the center of those gatherings. I nodded because I could not trust my voice. David did not look at me. The afternoon blurred into noise and movement. Voices echoed off the walls. Laughter filled rooms that had been quiet that morning. Someone turned on music. Someone else asked about drinks. The house no longer felt like a refuge. It felt like a stage I had been pushed off of. I wandered from room to room, unnoticed, watching my space transform. The furniture was shifted slightly. Personal items were moved aside. My presence was reduced to whatever could not be easily relocated. I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror and barely recognized myself. My shoulders were hunched. My expression was flat. I looked smaller, like I had already accepted the role they were assigning me. That realization made my stomach twist. Elaine continued to assert herself, suggesting changes, making plans out loud. Linda backed her up without hesitation. Robert smoothed over any tension with jokes, turning everything into a laugh. Daw stayed quiet, but his silence was a choice. He did not stop them. He did not remind anyone that this was my home. He let it unfold. By the time evening crept in, I found myself standing alone in the garage. The door was half open, letting in cool air that smelled like oil and wood and dust. My belongings were stacked in neat piles along the wall. Boxes labeled in my handwriting sat beside suitcases I had not planned to open. Again, so soon. I ran my hand over the top of one box, feeling the rough cardboard under my fingers. Inside were photos of Mom, letters I had kept, things that mattered to me, things that had been moved without a second thought. From inside the house, laughter floated out. Someone was pouring drinks. Someone else called out that dinner would be ready soon. The sounds felt distant, muffled, like they belonged to another life. I stood there longer than I should have, breathing slowly, grounding myself in the present moment. This was the cost of silence. This was what happened when people mistook restraint for surrender. But standing there among my boxed-up life, something else settled in: clarity. They were not acting like guests. They were acting like owners. And I was being erased in real time. As I turned back toward the house, I caught sight of Dad through the doorway. He was laughing at something Elaine had said, his hand resting casually on her back. The gesture was familiar, unguarded. It landed like a physical blow. I stepped back into the garage and closed the door behind me, cutting off the noise. For a moment, I let myself feel it all. The shock, the hurt, the deep betrayal that had nothing to do with space and everything to do with being unseen. Then I straightened, because this was no longer about a crowded house or misplaced boxes. This was about control, about entitlement, about how easily my place had been taken for granted. And I understood something then, standing alone in that quiet space. This was not temporary. This was not a misunderstanding. This was a deliberate reshaping of my role in this family. And I was done pretending I could survive by staying invisible. And I knew, with a calm that surprised me, that once that line is crossed, nothing ever goes back to the way it was before. That night, sleep came in shallow waves. The house was alive in a way that felt invasive. Footsteps moved overhead. Someone laughed too loudly down the hall. A door closed, then opened again. Every sound reminded me that I was no longer alone in a space that had been, meant to hold me and only me. I lay in the attic staring at the ceiling, replaying small moments from the day. The way Elaine had spoken. The way Dad had responded. The way everyone else acted like this arrangement had existed long before I arrived. It was not one big revelation that broke me open. It was the accumulation of details that no longer fit together the way I had believed. Morning came too quickly. When I went downstairs, Elaine was already there again, moving comfortably through the kitchen. She had tied her hair back and was humming quietly as she poured herself coffee. She did not ask where anything was. She knew. She knew which cabinet held the mugs, which drawer held the utensils. She knew how the stove worked. Dad sat at the table reading something on his phone. When she handed him a cup, he thanked her without looking up. It was a small exchange, ordinary, but it carried the weight of routine, the kind of routine that only comes with time. She mentioned something about the weather last spring, how unpredictable it had been, how they had almost gotten caught in a storm while driving through the mountains. Dad nodded and added a detail, correcting her gently about which road they had taken. That truth settled into me with a dull ache. Later that morning, as people filtered in and out of the kitchen, I overheard bits of conversation that confirmed what I was beginning to understand. Linda referred to Elaine as if she were already family. Robert joked about how long Dad had resisted settling down again. Someone else commented that it was nice to see Dad happy after everything he had been through. Everything he had been through. I waited until the moment felt right, until the conversation lulled, before asking the question that had been pressing against my ribs all morning. I asked when Elaine had come into Dad's life. The room went quiet in a way that felt deliberate. Linda looked at me with something like pity. Robert cleared his throat. No one answered right away. That pause told me more than any words could. Linda finally spoke. She said it had been a while. She said it started as companionship. She said Dad had needed support when Mom got sick. She said they had all agreed it was best not to overwhelm me at the time. I asked how long. She hesitated, then said it had been before Mom passed. The words landed softly, but the impact was seismic. Before Mom passed. I felt heat rise up my neck, a mix of anger and something colder, sharper. I asked if everyone knew. Robert nodded. He said yes. He said they thought I had enough on my plate. He said they assumed Dad would tell me when he was ready. I stood there, listening, my hands resting flat against the counter to keep them from shaking. I was aware of my breathing, slow and controlled, like I was bracing myself against a strong wind. They had known. All of them. They had sat beside me at Mom's funeral. They hugged me while I cried. They had told me how strong I was, how proud Mom would be of me. And all the while, they had been carrying this knowledge, passing it quietly between them. Decision for me, what I could and could not handle. The pain that followed was not explosive. It was a slow collapse. I remembered the weeks after Mom died, the way the house she had lived in felt hollow, the way Dad avoided conversations, said he was not ready. I remembered asking him gently if he wanted company, if he needed help, if he was lonely. Each time, he said he just needed time. I believed him. Now I wondered how many evenings he had spent with Elaine while telling me he was not ready to talk. How many holidays had been quietly split? How many decisions had been made with her input while I was kept at a distance? What hurt the most was not that Dad had found comfort elsewhere. It was that everyone else had decided I did not deserve honesty. They had protected him by sacrificing my trust. The realization reframed everything. The takeover of my house, the way Elaine moved through it like she belonged, the way Dad deferred to her. It was not sudden. It was simply the first time I had been forced to see it clearly. Dad did not address the conversation. He did not come find me. He did not explain. He avoided my eyes for the rest of the day, busying himself with tasks that did not need doing. When Elaine spoke to me, she was polite, almost careful, as if she knew the truth was out now and no longer needed to be hidden. There was a subtle shift in her tone, less cautious, more assured. That afternoon, I took a walk outside, just to clear my head. The mountains stretched out around the house, steady and unmoved by the drama unfolding within it. The air was crisp. The ground crunched under my boots. I breathed deeply, trying to steady myself. I thought about Mom, about how fiercely she believed in honesty, even when it was uncomfortable. She never hid things to spare feelings. She believed adults deserved the truth. I imagined her reaction if she knew this had been kept from me. The thought made my throat tighten. When I returned to the house, the atmosphere felt heavier. Conversations dropped when I entered the room. People glanced at me and then away. The knowledge was out, but no one seemed interested in addressing the damage it had caused. That evening, as dinner was prepared, Elaine stood beside Dad, discussing plans for the coming days. She talked about hosting, about inviting people, about how perfect the house was for gatherings. She mentioned, casually, that it would make a beautiful place for a wedding someday. The word hung in the air. No one reacted. No one questioned it. Dad smiled faintly. I felt something inside me finally go still. Later, I found myself back in the garage, sitting on one of the boxes that held my life, my back against the cool concrete wall. The door was closed this time, shutting out the noise. I sat there in the quiet and let myself feel the full weight of what had happened. This was not just about being pushed aside in my own home. This was about being excluded from the truth of my own family, about having my role quietly diminished while decisions were made around me. They had not trusted me with reality, and trust, once broken thoroughly, does not mend easily. When I finally stood and walked back toward the house, I moved with a different awareness. The hurt was still there, but it was accompanied by clarity. I could see the pattern now. The way silence had been used as a tool, the way my compliance had been mistaken for consent. I climbed the stairs to the attic and sat on the edge of the bed, looking around the small space that had become my refuge. I understood then that this was not just a temporary discomfort to endure. This was a turning point. They had taken my space. They had taken my right to know the truth. They had assumed I would adapt, absorb, stay quiet. They were wrong. As I lay back and closed my eyes, the house settled around me, full of other people's lives and plans. But inside, something had shifted into place. I was done being the last to know, and I was done being treated like my feelings were an inconvenience to be managed. Whatever came next, it would not be built on silence. They were about to learn the difference. Dinner stretched longer than it needed to, as if the house itself was trying to absorb the weight of what had just been, he said. Plates sat half-finished. Glasses were refilled without anyone asking. The conversation kept circling back to the wedding, even when someone tried to change the subject. It was like a current pulling everything toward it. Elaine leaned into it fully. She talked about seasons, about how beautiful the mountains would look with fall colors, or maybe spring flowers if they waited a bit. She said the house had such good energy, such a welcoming feeling. She said it was perfect for starting a new chapter. I noticed how often she used the word our when she talked about space. Our view, our porch, our kitchen. Each time, Dad nodded along, smiling faintly, occasionally adding a detail or correcting her gently. He seemed pleased, almost relieved, like something he had been carrying quietly was finally out in the open. Linda was already mentally redecorating. She talked about linens and centerpieces, about how the living room could be rearranged to make space for dancing. Robert joked about how loud the music should be, about neighbors complaining, about who would drink too much. Laughter followed his comments, easy and unburdened. I sat there listening, my hands resting flat against the table, feeling strangely detached from my own body. It reminded me of being in a long meeting at work where a decision had already been made before I walked in. You could speak if you wanted to, but it would not change the outcome. At one point, someone asked how many guests the house could hold comfortably. Elaine answered before I could, saying they would make it work, that people could stay nearby if needed. She spoke with the authority of someone who had already measured the space in her mind. Dad reached for her hand briefly under the table. The gesture was small, but it did not go unnoticed. I felt a familiar pressure build in my chest, the old instinct to object, to push back, to claim my ground. But I had learned long ago that resistance in moments like this often only strengthened the resolve of the people pushing. They were energized now, united in excitement. Anything I said would be framed as negativity, selfishness, or lack of support, so I chose my words carefully. When the conversation finally turned back to me directly, when Elaine looked at me with that expectant smile and asked if I was okay with everything, I did not rush to answer. I took a sip of water. I breathed. I said that if they wanted to plan something like that, they would need to take care of all the details themselves. I said I was not in a position to host or organize. I said it calmly, without emotion, the way I would speak to a client setting boundaries around a project. There was a pause. Elaine tilted her head slightly, then smiled wider, relief softening her face. She said, of course, they would not expect me to do all that. Linda jumped in immediately, saying she loved planning events and would be happy to help. Robert clapped his hands together and joked that it was settled then. No one asked what I meant beyond that. No one asked if the house was available. No one asked if I wanted this. Dad finally spoke, saying he just wanted everyone to feel comfortable and happy. He said it like a conclusion, like the matter was resolved. I realized then how easily my neutrality had been reinterpreted. They heard permission where I had offered distance. They heard an agreement where I had offered restraint. The rest of the evening unfolded in a blur. Someone put on music. Someone else cleared the table. Elaine moved through the house with a lightness I had not seen before, already picturing herself as a bride, already acting like the future was secured. She stopped by the attic stairs at one point and looked up, commenting that it might make a nice space for extra storage once things settled down. She said it casually, like an observation, not a suggestion. I nodded without responding. Later, as people drifted into smaller groups, Elaine approached me with a glass of wine. She thanked me for being understanding. She said she knew it was a lot to take in. She said she hoped we could start fresh as a family. Family. The word felt heavy on my tongue. She mentioned Mom then, saying she thought Mom would want Dad to be happy. The way she said it felt rehearsed, careful. I wondered how many times she had practiced that sentence. I said nothing. Dad passed by us, his hand resting briefly on Elaine's back. His face relaxed. He did not look at me, not once. That hurt more than the announcement itself. As the night wore on, the house filled with talk of logistics. Who would invite whom? Where people would stay? How long they might need the house? Someone joked about turning it into a wedding compound for a week. Laughter followed. I excused myself quietly and went upstairs. The attic was dim, lit only by a small lamp I had brought up earlier. I sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the muffled sounds below. It struck me how easily my life had become background noise in my own home. I thought about Mom again, about how she would have handled this. She had never been loud, but she had been firm. She did not confuse kindness with compliance. I wondered when I had learned to. The calm I felt earlier settled deeper, anchoring itself in something steady. This was not a shock anymore. It was understanding. They believed the house was a resource to be shared, a backdrop for their milestones, a gift I owed them simply because I had it. They believed my success meant availability. They believed my silence meant consent. Downstairs, Elaine laughed loudly at something Robert said. Dad's voice followed, warm and familiar. The sound carried up through the floor, filling the space around me. I lay back and stared at the ceiling, tracing the faint lines in the wood. I thought about the years I had worked to build a life that felt like mine, the hours, the sacrifices, the loneliness I had accepted because I believed it would lead to independence. And now, here I was, being gently but firmly pushed aside in favor of a narrative that did not include me as an equal. They were confident now, confident that I would adapt, as I always had, confident that my role was to make room. I closed my eyes and let the noise fade into the background. For the moment, I would let them think they had won, because there was power in being underestimated. And while they planned flowers and guest lists and ceremonies, I was doing something else entirely. I was paying attention. Once that thought settled in, everything shifted. I stopped reacting and started observing, the way I had learned to do years ago in conference rooms where decisions were made before I ever opened my mouth. There is a particular clarity that comes when you stop trying to be heard and start watching who assumes authority without earning it. The house became a stage, and everyone revealed themselves. The first thing I noticed was how quickly plans moved forward without me. Phone calls were made openly at the kitchen table. Linda spoke into her phone about dates and availability, her voice confident, already promising things she had no right to promise. She talked about guest counts, about using the backyard for a ceremony, about needing tables and chairs delivered. Robert chimed in constantly, offering opinions, suggesting music, joking about how wild the party would be. He spoke like someone who believed enthusiasm could replace responsibility. He loved the sound of his own excitement. Elaine was the quiet center of it all. She did not make many calls herself, but she directed them. She leaned over shoulders, whispered suggestions, nodded approval, or shook her head subtly. When someone hesitated, she reassured them. When someone overreached, she smoothed it over. Dad stayed close to her side, backing her up with his presence more than his words. When she said something was fine, he agreed. When she dismissed a concern, he waved it away. His silence was not passive. It was an alignment. And through all of it, no one asked me to sign anything. That detail mattered. I noticed when Linda tried to get me to confirm dates. I responded vaguely, saying they would need to coordinate among themselves. When someone mentioned deposits, I nodded and said they should make sure everything was clear. I never reached for my wallet. I never offered to put anything on my card. They did not push. They assumed. They assumed that because the house was mine, the risk would be mine too. That assumption would cost them. In between the noise and planning, I began doing my own quiet work. I woke early, before the house filled with voices, and sat at the small desk in the attic with my laptop. I looked up county regulations. I searched for zoning rules. I read through the homeowner association guidelines that had been included in my purchase documents, but never needed before. The language was dry, technical, but clear. There were limits on the number of people allowed at private events. There were permit requirements for gatherings over a certain size. There were liability clauses that outlined responsibility for injuries, property damage, noise complaints. Most importantly, there were penalties, fines, forced shutdowns, legal responsibility that fell squarely on whoever organized the event, not necessarily the homeowner, if that person was not involved in planning or contracts. I took notes, I saved links, I did not print anything. I did not share what I found. I was not trying to stop them. I was trying to understand exactly how far they were willing to go without asking permission. During the day, I listened more than I spoke. I heard Elaine promise the house to a vendor for a full weekend. I heard Linda tell a caterer that the space could handle more guests than it reasonably could. I heard Robert invite people who were not family, people I had never met. Each promise landed like a marker on a map. I noticed how confidently they spoke on my behalf. They said things like, "We have plenty of room," and "This place is perfect for it," and "Claire is fine with it." My name was used casually, like a stamp of approval they believed they already had. David never corrected them. At one point, Elaine mentioned needing a permit. She laughed it off, saying no one would care, that it was private property. Dad agreed, saying it was not worth the hassle. Linda nodded, relieved. I stayed quiet. That evening, I stepped outside to take a call. Noah's name lit up my phone, and I felt an unexpected wave of relief just hearing his voice. He had been my closest friend for years, the one person who never tried to manage me or soften my edges. I told him what was happening. Not dramatically, just facts. He listened without interrupting, which was rare for him. When I finished, there was a pause on the line. Then he said something simple. "Do not save them from their own decisions." The words landed with weight. He reminded me that boundaries are not arguments. They are actions. He said that stepping in now would only reinforce the belief that I was responsible for cleaning up their messes. He told me to protect myself, not their comfort. After the call, I sat on the porch for a long time, watching the light shift over the mountains. I felt calmer than I had in days. Inside the house, planning continued at full speed. Boxes of supplies arrived. Linda spread fabric samples across the dining table. Elaine talked about timelines and expectations. Dad moved through it all like a guest in his own life, trusting that someone else had it handled. I noticed how no one checked with me about insurance, about permits, about responsibility. They did not want those details. They wanted the fantasy. I noticed how Elaine avoided looking at me when discussing costs, how Linda spoke louder when mentioning money, as if volume could turn assumption into fact, how Robert brushed off concerns with jokes. They were building something on air, and they believed I would be the ground beneath it. Late that night, after everyone had gone to bed, I walked through the house alone. I touched the walls, the railings, the door frames. I thought about what this place had meant to me when I bought it. Safety, quiet, control. I felt none of those things now. But I felt something else. Resolve. The surprise I had been thinking about was not dramatic. It was not loud. It did not involve confrontation or ultimatums. It was absent. It was the refusal to step in, the refusal to warn, the refusal to absorb consequences that were not mine. By the time I climbed back up to the attic, my mind was clear. I lay down and stared at the ceiling, listening to the distant sounds of planning and laughter below. They believed silence meant surrender. They believed inaction meant agreement. They believed I would catch them if they fell. They were wrong, and as sleep finally came, I understood exactly what my role would be from here on out. I would watch. I would document. I would let them walk straight into the reality they had chosen. Once that decision settled inside me, the noise of the house began to sound different. It was still loud, still crowded, but it no longer felt like it was pressing in on me. It felt distant, like something happening behind glass. I moved through rooms without announcing myself, listened without reacting, watched without being seen. There is a strange power in becoming invisible by choice. The days blurred together as planning accelerated. Every morning I woke early, before anyone else stirred, and sat at the small desk in the attic with a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. I listened to the house breathe, the quiet hum of appliances, the distant wind against the windows. Those moments were mine alone. Then I opened my laptop. I read everything. County ordinances, event regulations, noise restrictions, parking limits, emergency access requirements. I read the sections that people usually ignore, the fine print that only matters when something goes wrong. It mattered now. The rules were not ambiguous. They were clear, precise, and unforgiving. Private residences could host small gatherings without permits. Weddings were not small gatherings. Once guest counts crossed a certain number, permits were required. Liability shifted depending on who organized the event. Responsibility followed signatures, contracts, and verbal commitments. I did not bookmark the pages. I saved copies. I took screenshots. I made notes in a folder labeled, "Nothing at all." I was not planning an intervention. I was preparing for clarity. Downstairs, the planning took on a life of its own. Linda spent hours on the phone, pacing the living room, her voice sharp and cheerful as she talked to vendors. She promised things she could not guarantee. She spoke in absolutes. "Yes, that works. No problem. We have plenty of space." Robert chimed in whenever he could, adding energy, suggesting ideas, laughing off concerns. He treated it like a party he was hosting, not a legal responsibility he might be held accountable for. He loved the excitement, the feeling of momentum. Elaine orchestrated everything without appearing to. She positioned herself just close enough to influence decisions, just distant enough to avoid being blamed. When Linda hesitated, Elaine reassured her. When Robert overreached, Elaine softened it. When someone asked a question that hinted at consequences, Elaine smiled and redirected. Dad stayed beside her. Always. He did not make the calls, but he validated them. He did not sign anything, but he nodded approval. He did not promise money, but he never denied responsibility either. His presence alone gave everyone permission to keep going. I noticed something else, too. No one asked me to sign a single document, not once. When a vendor emailed asking for confirmation, the reply came from Linda's address. When deposits were discussed, someone else volunteered to handle it later. When questions arose about logistics, they were answered without consulting me. They were building a structure of assumptions and hoping I would fill in the gaps. I felt a familiar urge rise in me, the reflex to step in, to correct, to protect. It had been shaped over years of being the responsible one, the capable one, the person who smoothed over complications before they became problems. But Noah's words echoed in my head. Do not save them from their own decisions. I remembered the way he had said it. Not harshly, but with certainty. He knew me well enough to understand how hard this would be for me. He also knew that stepping in now would only reinforce the belief that my role was to absorb impact. So I stayed quiet. Emotionally, it was not easy. Every time Elaine referred to the house as ours, something twisted inside my chest. Every time Dad laughed with her, a small, sharp grief surfaced. Every time Linda spoke on my behalf, I felt my jaw tighten. But I did not speak. Instead, I paid attention. I noticed how often Elaine avoided eye contact with me when discussing money. I noticed how Linda's confidence wavered when someone mentioned permits. I noticed how Robert deflected with humor whenever responsibility came up. I noticed that no one mentioned insurance. That detail mattered too. One afternoon, while they were busy arguing about flowers, I slipped outside and took another call from Noah. I told him what I had learned, what I had observed. I told him how hard it was to keep my mouth shut. He listened, then reminded me that silence was not passivity, it was a strategy. He told me I was allowed to protect my peace without protecting their fantasy. When the call ended, I sat on the porch and stared out at the mountains, steady and indifferent. They had seen generations come and go. They did not flinch at drama. I envied that. Inside, planning continued at full speed. Boxes arrived. Fabric samples were spread across furniture that used to feel like mine. Elaine talked about timelines, about guests arriving early, about how they might need the house for more than one day. She never asked. Dad never objected. I felt something harden inside me. Not bitterness, but resolve. At night, when the house finally quieted, I walked through it alone. I noticed the way my presence had been erased from common spaces. My books moved aside. My photos are stacked in corners. My routines were disrupted. I also noticed how fragile their plans were. How much depends on things going smoothly. How many assumptions had been made without verification. As the days passed, my emotions shifted from hurt to clarity. I stopped replaying conversations. I stopped imagining what I should have said. I focused on what was happening now. By the time I lay down each night, listening to the house settle, I felt steady. The anger had burned off, leaving something cleaner behind. They did not think they were hurting me. They thought they were entitled to my space, my resources, my understanding. Watching would not stop the momentum now. Every day that passed tightened the knot in my stomach a little more. Not from fear, but from the awareness that everyone in that house felt utterly confident they were in control. 1 week before the wedding, the shift was unmistakable. The house had a pulse of its own. You could feel it in the floors, in the way conversations overlapped, in the hurried footsteps echoing down the hallway before sunrise. That morning, I woke to the low murmur of voices traveling up the staircase. When I reached the attic landing, I heard Linda complaining again about her room. She said the mattress was stiff. She said the air conditioner made too much noise. She said the window faced the wrong view. Her voice sharpened whenever she mentioned discomfort, as if discomfort were a personal injustice. I listened from the top of the stairs, unseen, as she demanded a different room. Elaine was standing in the living room with her arms crossed. She did not look up when Linda entered. She simply said that the rooms had been assigned already. She said everything had been planned with purpose. She said changing things now would only complicate the week. Dad walked in a few moments later. Linda immediately turned to him, appealing the decision. Like a child appealing a teacher. David rubbed his forehead and told her they were all under pressure. Then he said something that made my breath stop. He said Elaine had thought through every detail, and everyone needed to trust her judgment. Elaine did not even pretend to be humble. She smiled, soft and satisfied, then gave Linda a look that settled the matter. Linda closed her mouth, but did not hide her resentment. I stepped quietly back toward the attic before anyone noticed me watching. But inside, something tightened. Mom had been gone less than 2 years, and I had never once seen Dad hand over authority like that. He had been stubborn, even when it hurt him. But now he deferred to Elaine without hesitation. Like her comfort mattered more than anyone else's. Like her voice deserved obedience. As the day unfolded, the pace only intensified. Deliveries arrived in clusters. Folding tables, coolers, boxes of artificial flowers, a set of silver candle holders, more than 20 linen bags filled with decorative cloth. Everything stacked in corners, leaning against walls, crowding out the last reminders that the house had once been a place of quiet. Elaine directed each delivery with the ease of someone who believed she belonged in charge. She opened boxes, criticized items, rearranged the space without asking. She even removed a framed photograph of Mom and tucked it into a drawer. Say the shelf needed to be clear for display pieces. I took a slow breath and asked where she put the picture. She said she did not remember. Dad was standing right next to her. He heard everything, and he stayed silent. The photograph was never found. Around noon, we had our first vendor incident. The rental company called with questions about parking and setup. Elaine put the call on speaker and answered confidently until the representative asked about parking capacity for large trucks. Elaine froze. She pretended the call was cutting out, then handed me the phone. I could feel her watching me closely. The vendor asked if the driveway could support vehicle access. She asked if there was an alternate path. She asked if the backyard had reinforced areas for staging. I answered honestly and non-committally. I said the driveway was typical for the area. I said staging needed confirmation from the event organizer. I said I was not involved in planning. The representative paused. Then she asked the question I knew had been coming. She asked who held responsibility for the event. Elaine stepped closer, almost into my space, as if she could control the words as they left my mouth. I met her eyes. Then I told the vendor she should direct all decisions to Elaine and Linda, who were organizing the event and signing agreements. There was another pause. Then the vendor said she understood and would adjust her paperwork. After the call, Elaine smiled thinly and said, "I could have just said yes." I told her it was important that vendors heard from the correct decision makers. Dad walked in during the conversation. Elaine touched his arm as she complained lightly about the vendor confusion. He looked at me the same way he sometimes looked at broken tools in the garage, a mix of disappointment and irritation. He asked me to be more supportive. I asked him what he meant. He said the wedding was a new beginning for everyone, and it would mean a lot if I lifted some of the burden. He said this house was part of the family now. He said Mom would want unity. That sentence landed like a slap. I kept my voice steady and asked him not to use Mom to justify decisions she never had the chance to weigh in on. Elaine stepped between us just a fraction, enough to show where she believed the boundary now lay. She told Dad they should not bother me, that I had enough on my mind. The condescension was not lost on either of us. Later that same afternoon, another vendor arrived early, without notification. A photographer. Young. Nervous. She said Elaine had insisted she scout the property for angles immediately. When she saw the tension in the house, she asked quietly if everything was all right. I told her she should coordinate directly with the event planners. She whispered that she was unsure who that actually was. I almost laughed. Instead, I walked her to the backyard so she could take her measurements. She looked around and said it was beautiful. She said it would photograph well. She said the lighting at sunset would be perfect. Then she hesitated. She asked if the neighbors would mind a large gathering. I told her every property in the mountains was different. She looked at me with worry, as if she sensed something off. She thanked me and left quickly. By the time the sun began to dip, the house buzzed with overlapping conversations again. Robert stood at the counter trimming wicks on the candle holders, humming tunelessly. Linda paced near the front window, muttering about guest arrivals. Elaine sat at the kitchen island, writing a new list. David hovered nearby, ready to help, but waiting for her instructions. At one point, Elaine announced that a few more guests might arrive early. She said they would need extra bedrooms. She said we could make space by moving some of my things into the attic, permanently. Dad nodded before I could say a word. Elaine looked directly at me as she spoke, her expression calm, challenging. Confidence. She said it was just temporary. She said I was so gracious that she knew I would not mind. Dad said he appreciated my flexibility. I said nothing. But inside, something finally settled. A deep, cold understanding. They were not simply using the house. They were testing the limits of my silence. They believed silence meant surrender. They believed lack of resistance meant approval. They believed their comfort mattered more than my dignity. After dinner, I stepped outside alone. The air was cooler, the sky streaked with darkening blue. I leaned against the railing and took slow breaths. I needed space from the noise, from the shifting alliances, from the old wound of being a daughter who owed more than she was allowed to. Question. The screen door opened. Dad stepped out. He said he wanted to talk. He said he felt tension. He said he wished I would be more positive. He said all families had difficult moments before big celebrations. Then he said something I will never forget. He said he hoped I understood that this wedding was a chance for everyone to move forward, and that I needed to let go of the past. The past. As if Mom were the past. As if the betrayal I had uncovered about Elaine and their long-hidden relationship were simply sentimentality I should release. As if the truth did not matter because it inconvenienced the story they wished to tell. I asked him if he truly believed I should give up my home for theirs. Celebration. He said he was not giving up. It was contributing. He said that is what families do. He said one day I would understand. Then he touched my shoulder and said he knew I would make the right choice. The right choice. The words tasted bitter. Inside the house, laughter rose again. Elaine's, Linda's, Robert's. It sounded like triumph. I went back inside quietly. I climbed the stairs to the attic and closed the door. The house hummed below me with anticipation and entitlement. 1 week before the wedding, everything looked ready. Perfect. Organized. Triumphant. On their paper, not mine. They had built an entire event on assumptions, claimed a home that was not theirs, and convinced themselves that I had surrendered. But the truth was far simpler. I was waiting. I woke before the sun, long before anyone else in the house stirred. The mountains were quiet outside the attic window, the kind of soft stillness that makes you believe nothing can disrupt it. But today, that calm felt deceptive. It was the morning before the wedding, the day everyone had poured their energy into, the day they believed would unfold exactly as Elaine had planned. I sat on the edge of the bed for a few minutes, letting the silence settle over me. I wanted to remember the feeling, because once the house woke, there would be no turning back. I went downstairs around 6. The kitchen was empty, but the remnants of the previous night were still scattered across the counters, empty glasses, crumpled napkins, a half-written list in Elaine's handwriting. My eyes caught a line that read, "Final setup, 10 a.m. mandatory." The confidence in the handwriting made my stomach tighten, not from fear, but from the certainty that today would be the day their certainty met reality. I made myself coffee and stood by the window. The driveway was still empty, the long gravel stretch leading out to the road framed by the morning haze. I could already picture the line of vans and trucks that would come soon, vendors expecting permission, expecting order, expecting compliance. Around 7, the first sounds of movement echoed from upstairs. Linda complained about needing more hot water. Robert shuffled toward the kitchen with heavy footsteps. Elaine called out instructions before she had even reached the bottom of the staircase, Dad trailing behind her like a shadow, nodding when she paused, waiting for her to speak again. Elaine entered the kitchen and stopped when she saw me. She had curled her hair, applied makeup, and dressed in light clothes that gave her an effortless confidence. She smiled, wide and bright, almost blinding. Today is a big day. She said it in a tone that assumed I shared her excitement. I nodded politely. She took that nod as approval. Dad stepped closer, reaching for a mug. He avoided my eyes. He asked if I had slept well. I said yes, it was the truth. Linda joined us, complaining about the noise outside, even though the house was still quiet. She asked who was in charge of setting up the chairs. Elaine assured her everything was under control. That phrase had become Elaine's anthem. Robert arrived last, yawning loudly, asking what time the caterers would show. Elaine told him they were expecting around 9. Then she looked at me again. Not directly, but with the expectation that I should be preparing to accommodate the chaos. I sipped my coffee and said nothing. The first van rolled up the driveway at 8:40, a large white catering truck with a painted logo on the side. When it slowed to a stop, I could see 2 people inside the cab. One of them stepped out first, a woman in her 50s with short gray hair and sharp eyes. She walked with purpose and carried a clipboard under her arm. She approached the porch with a calm confidence that reminded me of someone who had done this exact job 100 times. Elaine rushed outside before the woman could even reach the steps. She greeted her with manufactured warmth and began explaining where she wanted everything to go. The woman listened politely but did not move. I stepped outside and stood near the door, not interrupting, just a present. The woman finally introduced herself as Janice, the head coordinator for the catering team. She said her crew was ready to begin setup but needed confirmation from the homeowner for liability purposes. Elaine laughed lightly and said everything was already approved. Janice turned her head slightly and looked directly at me. "Are you the homeowner?" Elaine jumped in before I could respond. She said we had already discussed everything weeks ago. She said the house was 100% available. She said the event was fully authorized. Janice did not look at her. She kept her eyes on me. There was no aggression, Only professionalism, I answered calmly. Yes, I own the property. Elaine smiled as if that settled things. Then Janice asked the question that would shift the entire day. And have you signed the event authorization? Elaine's smile barely faltered. She answered before I opened my mouth. Yes, of course. Everything is taken care of. I held her gaze for a long moment. Then I turned to Janice. I have not signed any authorization. I have not approved the use of my home for a wedding. I have not granted permission for an event of any size on my property. Janice blinked slowly. She shifted her clipboard, flipping to a page that had a blank line where my signature should have been. She asked if there was any written agreement at all. I said no. She asked if I had spoken to any vendors. I said, only to redirect them to the people planning the event. She asked if I was aware of event regulations for the county. I nodded. Yes, very aware. Elaine stepped forward, hands shaking slightly, trying to regain control. She said there must be a misunderstanding. She said permits were optional. She said they had already coordinated everything. She said Janice could start unloading while we sorted out the paperwork. Janice stood firm. She said her company required either a written authorization or a verified county permit before unloading a single item. She said liability laws were strict. She said no signature meant no event. David stepped down from the porch and raised his hands in a placating gesture. He told Janice it was all a simple mix-up. He said I was being overly cautious. He said it was a family matter and that surely we could work something out. Janice did not budge. She said she could not set up on a property without documented permission. She said her company had been fined before and would not risk it again. She said she would wait 10 minutes for clarification, and if none came, she would have to call a county officer to verify compliance. Elaine paled. Dad looked from her to me, searching my face for some sign of compromise. I offered none. Vendors began arriving one by one. A floral delivery van, a tent company truck, a photographer with equipment. Each of them approached with expectation, and each was halted by Janice, who repeated the same explanation. The homeowner has not granted permission. Guests began arriving early too, dressed casually but excited. They approached the porch with smiles, carrying bags and gifts. When they heard there was an issue, they lingered near the steps, whispering, glancing at me as if waiting for me to reassure them. Elaine moved quickly from group to group, trying to control the growing panic. She kept saying everything was fine. She blamed paperwork delays. She said I was simply overwhelmed. She said I did not understand how weddings worked. Dad followed her, echoing her reassurances. He told guests to relax. He said these things happened. He said the setup would begin any minute, but the cracks were widening. Janice stepped aside to make a phone call. A few minutes later, a county vehicle pulled into the driveway. A uniformed officer got out, carrying a folder. He spoke briefly with Janice, then approached the porch. He asked who the property owner was. I stepped forward. He asked if a permit had been filed. I said no. He asked if I had authorized the event. I said no. He asked if I was aware of county regulations regarding large gatherings. I said yes. He nodded. He said the event could not legally proceed without permits and homeowner approval. He said continued attempts to set up would violate county codes. He said vendors would have to leave. He said guests could not stay on the property for an unapproved event. He said it all clearly, calmly, professionally. Elaine's face was drained of all color. David looked like someone had struck him. Linda burst into tears. Robert swore under his breath. Guests murmured, confused, disappointed, irritated. One woman asked loudly why nothing had been prepared. Another asked if there was another location. A third asked why no one had told them the homeowner had not agreed. Elaine snapped that I had changed my mind at the last minute. I turned to her slowly. I did not change my mind. I was never asked for my consent. Dad stepped between us, trying to mediate, trying to soften the impact. He said surely we could find a solution. He said the officer was being rigid. He said maybe we could talk privately. But the officer shook his head. He said the matter was closed. He said any attempt to hold the event would result in fines. He said vendors were to leave now. Janice thanked him and told her team to reload everything. The sound of equipment being packed back into the truck was the loudest thing I had ever heard in that driveway. Elaine turned on me then, fury shaking her entire body. She said I had sabotaged her wedding. She said I had embarrassed the entire family. She said I had done it out of spite. I looked at her calmly. I reminded her that she planned a wedding in a house she did not own. I reminded her that she promised things she had no right to promise. I reminded her that she ignored every responsibility that came with planning an event of this size. David looked at me with disbelief, as if he had never seen me before. Guests began leaving in clusters, disappointment turning to irritation turning to resentment. The house grew quieter with each car that pulled away. By the time the last vendor drove off, the silence was complete, and the wedding could not happen at Mountain House. The silence after the last vendor left was heavier than anything that had happened earlier in the day. It settled into the walls, into the floors, into the mountain air itself. For a few long seconds, no one moved. No one spoke. It felt like the entire world was exhaling in one slow, disappointed breath. Then Linda broke the silence. She stepped toward me with her arms stiff at her sides, her face twisted with disbelief. She asked what kind of person ruins their own father's wedding. Her voice cracked on the word father, as if she alone understood what real loyalty meant. Robert stood behind her, shaking his head, muttering to himself. Guests who had lingered on the porch glanced over their shoulders, whispering, as though they were witnessing something they wanted to escape, but also wanted to remember. Elaine looked the worst. Her face was flushed, her eyes glassy, her breath uneven. She took one step toward me, then another, until she was almost close enough to touch me. She did not reach out, but her hands trembled with effort as she tried to hold back the explosion could see rising inside her. She said I had humiliated her. She said I was selfish. She said I had sabotaged everything she and Dad had worked for. Her voice grew louder with each accusation. She gestured wildly toward the driveway, toward the empty spaces where the trucks had been moments earlier. She said I had embarrassed her in front of her family, in front of her friends, in front of the entire community. David walked up behind her while she spoke, his face pulled into a deep frown. When he looked at me, there was hurt there, but also something harder, something that made my stomach knot. He asked why I had done this. He asked why I had waited until the last minute. He asked how I could do this to him. He said he had never felt so ashamed. Ashamed. That word hit me like a stone. It bounced around my chest, sharp and cutting. There was a moment where my breath caught in my throat, not because I doubted myself, but because of how easily he had chosen his narrative, how quickly he believed this was about hurting him, not about boundaries that had been violated from the very beginning. For the first time in days, I felt something break free inside me. Not anger, not grief, something steadier than both. I stood straighter. Linda stepped closer, pointing a finger at me. She said I owed the family an explanation. She said real families did not behave like this. She said I should feel guilty for putting Dad in such an awful position. Robert chimed in, saying all I had done was create drama. He said Mom would be disappointed in me. He said I needed to forgive and forget. Something in me went still. Elaine crossed her arms and asked how I could betray Dad by doing nothing to support his happiness. She said Dad deserved better. She said I had held on to the house like a spoiled child. She said I should have been grateful they wanted to create memories here. Memories. As if memory was something that could be painted over grief. Dad finally spoke again. He asked why I had not simply agreed. He said it was just one day. He said families shared. He said this was a chance for all of us to heal, and I had thrown it away. I let the words sink in for a moment. Not so they could persuade me, but so they could clarify every fracture in this family that I had been ignoring for too long. Then I exhaled slowly and spoke for the first time since the officer left. I told them this was my house, not a metaphorical house, not a symbolic house, but a legally owned, personally purchased, deeply meaningful home that I had worked for through 70 and 80 hours, weeks, for years. A house I had bought to rebuild myself after losing Mom. I reminded them that no one had asked me if I was comfortable hosting them wedding. Not once. Not one single time. Instead, they had informed me. They had assigned me a role. They had told me where to sleep. They had moved my things without permission. They had treated my space like a public venue. Elaine opened her mouth, but I held up a hand. For once, she stopped. I continued. I told them I had never agreed to a wedding, that I had never given authorization, that I had never promised anything about using my property as a venue. I reminded them that they had made plans based on assumptions and entitlement, not conversation. Linda scoffed and said I was exaggerating, that I had seemed agreeable, that silence meant consent. I turned to her and asked when silence ever meant consent from a daughter, trying to keep peace in a family that only listened when she had something they wanted. She had no answer. Elaine stepped forward again and said I had misled them. She said I should have spoken up sooner. She said communication was a two-way street. She said I had blindsided her. I looked at her for a long moment before asking how she believed communication worked. When she never once asked a question. When she took my home and treated it like a prize she had earned. When she stood in my kitchen and rearranged my belongings without permission. When she removed Mom's photograph and then pretended not to know where she put it. Her cheeks flushed again. Dad finally raised his voice. He asked what Mom had to do with any of this. The air shifted then. My heart pounded against my ribs. Not from fear, but from something heavier, something deeper, something that had been lodged inside me since the moment I realized Elaine had been part of his life before Mom had even passed. I said Mom had everything to do with it. I said Mom had been left in the dark. I said I had been left in the dark. I said the family had known about Elaine long before they admitted it. I said I had learned the truth from whispers and glances, not honesty. I said they had chosen to protect Dad from discomfort instead of protecting me from betrayal. Dad's face hardened. He told me not to speak about things I did not understand. He said Elaine came into his life when he needed companionship. He said it had nothing to do with Mom. He said no one had intended to hurt me. That last line stung in a nostalgic way, as if lack of intention excused the damage. Elaine looked over at Dad quickly, as if checking whether he wanted her to stay quiet. But she did not wait for the cue. She told me I had no right to judge their relationship, that life moves forward. That grief does not give anyone permission to control the happiness of others. Her voice had grown sharper, more desperate, not remorseful. I told her I was not judging their relationship. I was judging the secrecy, the deliberate exclusion. The fact that everyone in Dad's family had known except me. The fact that they had kept me out of the truth of my own family. And then they had the audacity to demand my home as their celebration stage. No one spoke for a moment. Then Dad said something that cut deeper than anything else that day. He said I had made a fool of him. He said I had ruined his happiness. He said I cared more about a house than my own father. I inhaled softly. Then I told him the truth. I told him I cared about boundaries. I cared about respect. I cared about Mom's memory. I cared about being treated like a human being rather than a resource. I told him I had spent years trying to earn his approval, and that somewhere along the way, he had convinced himself that love meant sacrifice only when the sacrifice came from me. Linda muttered something about how I always made things difficult. Robert said I was dramatic. Elaine said all I cared about was control. I looked at each of them. Their angry faces, their hand gestures, their disappointment, their disbelief. And for the first time in a long time, I saw the truth clearly. They were not upset because the wedding was canceled. They were upset because they had lost control. My voice was steady when I spoke again. I told them they needed to leave. Elaine asked if I was serious. Her voice broke on the last word. I nodded. Dad stepped forward, shocked. He asked how I could turn away family. He asked how I could treat him this way. He asked if I understood what I was doing. My throat tightened for a moment, but I did not waver. I told him I understood exactly. Linda began arguing immediately, talking over herself, listing reasons they should stay. Robert said they had nowhere else to go on such short notice. Elaine said this was cruelty, that I had planned this, that I had humiliated them intentionally. I stood my ground. I told them they had 30 minutes to gather their things. The words came out calm, but inside something shook loose. Not fear, not guilt, something like a release. David stared at me as though he was seeing me for the first time. He asked if I truly meant for him to leave as well. I answered him without hesitation. Yes. The house went silent again. This time the silence belonged to me. They stood there frozen for a few moments after I told them to leave, as if waiting for me to laugh or take it back. But I did not move. I did not soften. I did not apologize. The porch lights cast long shadows beneath their feet, stretching across the boards like dark reminders that every step they took next would be their choice, not mine. Linda spoke first, muttering that I would regret this. Her voice wavered between anger and disbelief. She grabbed her bag and marched inside to gather her things, slamming doors and drawers as she went. Robert followed her, shaking his head and muttering under his breath. He avoided my eyes, but the disappointment in his expression tried to speak for him. Elaine remained rooted to the spot, face pale, eyes burning. For the first time since she arrived, she looked uncertain. Not defeated, not apologetic, just stunned that I was not bending. She searched my face for something she could argue with, but I had nothing left to give her. No emotion, no reaction, no space. Dad lingered the longest. He stood in front of me, shoulders tight, breathing heavy, looking older than I had ever seen him. He kept opening his mouth like he wanted to speak, but nothing came out. Maybe he wanted to plead. Maybe he wanted to curse me. Maybe he wanted to ask why I was not the daughter he expected. He finally said they would leave, but that this was not forgiveness, as if forgiveness was still something I was supposed to earn from him. I nodded once. He stared at me, waiting for something resembling regret. I did not offer any. Minutes later, I heard the sounds of suitcases being dragged across the hardwood floor, angry vibrations, heavy footsteps, the sharp clack of the front door being pulled open. One by one they exited, each with their own dramatic exhale, each trying to make their emotions my responsibility. Elaine passed me last. She looked at me with an expression full of disdain, the kind that says she believed she would win until the very end. She whispered that I had ruined everything. She said Dad would never forgive me. Then she walked to the car without looking back. Dad hesitated at the bottom of the steps before joining her. He gripped the railing, knuckles white, as if torn between pride and pleading, but he said nothing more. The car engine started. Headlights lit the driveway in long strokes of white. Gravel crunched beneath the tires. One by one, the cars pulled away from the house, shrinking until they vanished down the bend in the mountain road. And then there was silence. Not the silence of tension, not the silence of fear, not the silence of holding my breath, waiting for the next demand or accusation or violation. This silence belonged to me. The house exhaled with me. For the first time since the day they arrived, the space felt open, real, honest, mine. I closed the front door slowly, almost gently, as if sealing something behind me. The living room was a mess of abandoned decorations and forgotten lists. Ribbons, chargers, empty glasses, fabric scraps, the remnants of a wedding that never happened. I walked through the house room by room. The energy felt different in each one. The kitchen no longer buzzed with Elaine's frantic authority. The hallway no longer echoed with Linda's complaints. The living room no longer held Dad's quiet judgment. The air felt clean, still, soft. In the dining room, one of the centerpieces sat half-assembled on the table. I reached for it, then stopped. I realized I did not want to touch anything yet. I wanted to let the quiet wrap around me first. Upstairs, in the bedroom where my things should have been, the empty spaces stood like open wounds. Drawers left ajar. My clothes crumpled in a laundry basket that did not belong to me. A pair of shoes I had forgotten to move before they took the room, pushed into a corner with dust settling over them. I went to the garage next. The air smelled like cardboard and cold tools. My belongings were piled neatly along the wall, as if someone had moved them with the efficiency of a warehouse worker, not the respect of a family member handling personal items. Seeing my life compressed into stacked bins and pushed aside should have hurt more than it did. Instead, it gave me clarity. I saw exactly how little space I had been given, how easily I had been displaced, how natural it had seemed to them. I lifted my suitcase, then another box, and carried them back upstairs. The weight of them grounded me, each step a reminder that reclaiming my home did not require permission. I spent the next hour moving my things back to their original places. Clothes in drawers, books on shelves, photographs back on the dresser where Mom's picture belonged. When I found the frame Elaine had hidden, tucked behind a stack of towels in the linen closet, I held it in my hands for a long moment. Mom smiled back at me, the kind of smile that had always told me I would be okay. I placed the frame back in the bedroom, right where it had been before. Then I walked up to the attic and closed the door. I would use the space again someday, but not tonight. Tonight, I wanted to sleep in my own bed, under my own blankets, in a room that felt like mine again. When I went back downstairs, the house was dim except for the soft light over the sink. I turned it off and opened a few windows instead. Cool mountain air drifted inside, brushing against my skin. The quiet outside matched the quiet within. It felt like a reset, a beginning. I sat on the couch and leaned back, letting my shoulders drop for the first time in days. Every muscle softened, every breath deepened. I thought about what had happened. Not the confrontation, not the anger, not the accusations, or the disappointment etched across Dad's face. What stuck with me most was the realization that losing them did not feel like loss. I had not lost a family that day. I had lost the illusion of one. The illusion that love meant obedience, that silence meant peace, that pleasing others meant belonging, that my worth depended on how much I could give without breaking. Mom had always warned me that some people confuse love with convenience, that those people will convince you that boundaries are cruel and self-respect is selfishness. She had been right. The truth was simple. Family does not demand your home to prove your loyalty. The family does not hide important truths to maintain their comfort. Family does not expect you to sacrifice yourself for their convenience. Family does not call you selfish for reclaiming what is yours. What left my driveway that day was not family. It was an entitlement. It was a secret. It was controlled, wrapped in affection, and labeled as love. It was a weight I had carried long before I bought the mountain house, and setting it down felt like freedom. I stood and walked to the window. Outside, the mountains were dark against the sky, steady and unbothered. I opened the window wider, letting more cool air fill the room. A thought settled in me then, quiet but firm. Boundaries are not revenge. They are self-rescue. They are the moment you stop letting the world decide your value. The moment you stop apologizing for protecting your peace. The moment you stop mistaking tolerance for love. Setting boundaries does not make you cruel. It makes you whole. The house felt whole again, too. I walked back through the rooms one more time, touching furniture, straightening pillows, restoring the harmony they had tried to disrupt. Every small movement reminded me that I had reclaimed something much bigger than square footage. I had reclaimed myself. When I finally turned off the last light and stood at the foot of the stairs, I felt a strange calm. Deep, grounded, true. I whispered a quiet goodbye to the version of myself who had tolerated too much and called it family. Then I went upstairs and closed my bedroom door. If you are still listening, I hope you know this. If you have ever been told you were too much or not enough for your own family, remember this: silence can be power, and truth can be the loudest revenge. Tell me in the comments what integrity means to you and where you are listening from.